Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Cecile Shea. I am a special advisor and non-resident senior fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. At this time, when we are all so understandably preoccupied with our health, our family safety, with our own finances and our professional future, it can be challenging to keep abreast of what's going on in the world where decisions are being made that are going to affect us for decades. In some cases, existential decisions may be made. And the Council continues to be dedicated to bringing you thought-provoking conversations with people who can inform you of what is going on and also encourage you to try to do something to make our world a safer, better place. Sounds hackneyed, but that's what we all want at the end of the day.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my one
At this time, more than ever,
here.
the Council is also dedicated to continuing to provide research and studies, again, on the global situation, but also on what is going on in the Midwest and the ways that decisions made in Washington impact the Midwest. This is the 20th largest metro in the world. We are a major contributor to the GDP of the United States. And what happens in the Midwest, what happens in Chicago matters greatly. And the Council is a voice of the Midwest and of the Chicagoland area in Washington and beyond. So thank you to our members for your support. If you're not a member, we hope you will consider joining the Chicago Council. Our membership started at $100 and it's money well spent and well invested. I'm very pleased today to welcome two of the great thinkers currently working on political reform in the United States, on what ails us in the legislative branch, but also in the executive branch and government and polity-wide. I'll be introducing them in a moment. I do want to remind everyone that the Council is a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan platform. So the views expressed by individuals today, including myself, are our own, and they do not necessarily represent the institutional positions or the views of the Council. I'm pleased today to introduce, first of all, Thomas Mann. Tom is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and he joins us today from the Bay Area. He has taught at a number of prestigious universities around the United States, as well as teaching seminars overseas. He has chaired the Board of Overseers of the National Election Studies, and he appears frequently. You'll recognize his face now that you're looking at it. He appears frequently in newspapers, blogs, and on television, and has written a number of important books with our other guests. I'll get to the books in a moment with our other guest, Norm Ornstein. Norm is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, where he studies politics, elections, and the U.S. Congress. He was a senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. He has been involved in political reform for decades, particularly finance reform, as I said, particularly finance reform, repeating myself now, sorry, and reform in the Senate committees. Both men trace their roots to the Midwest and both have master's degrees and PhDs from the University of Michigan, but we hope that you Michigan Staters will stick with us anyway. In 2006, Tom and Norm published The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. Their next book, 6 years later, was the New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. They reissued an updated copy of that book in 2016, presciently named It's Even Worse Than It Was. Their most recent book in 2017, and I read it over the weekend, it's really fabulous. It's available at your local bookstore, including the bookseller, which has a long relationship with the Council. That's Seller with C-E-L-L-A-R, or available from your favorite online merchant. That book is One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. So, welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today. I thought that we would start kind of at the mechanics with some of the particulars, and then from there move up to 30,000 feet and look at how we got ourselves in some of the predicaments that we're currently in the first place. So let's start with continuity of government, which is something that both of you have been writing about and talking about for 20 years. And I know from some of your writings you found it's hard to get traction in Washington and other places. And when you talk about continuity of government, you're talking about the continuity of the electoral process. And we've seen recently of what happens when States and the federal government haven't amended their constitutions, their past laws to deal with exigencies that keep people from going to the polls on election day. And it could cause a huge problem this year in November if the pandemic is raging, or if there is a natural disaster, or if, God forbid, both occur at the same time. So one is, what should we be doing to ensure that we have an electoral process that offers the right to vote to everyone, even during emergency situations? Secondly, then we'll move to continuity of government, kind of the designated survivor plot, if anybody watched that TV show a few years ago, which we'll get to in a moment. And then we'll turn to the continuity in the work of Congress, which people are thinking a lot about right now. And then we'll move up 30,000 feet. Okay. So let's start with continuity of the electoral process. We've seen in New York, Wisconsin, what can happen when things go wrong. Norm, how do we repeat those things from happening again?
One of the stunning things, Cecile, is that over the entire history of the country, we've never developed backup plans if something went wrong on election day. And that's true today. It's true if there's something as sweeping as a pandemic that may mean that nobody in the country, or very few people in places, can actually turn out to vote. It could happen with a kind of cyber terror attack that, say, took out the electric grid in the Northeast. Are you going to not count the votes from those states? And how are you going to decide what becomes the majority of electoral votes? We know that Hurricane Michael was a once in a century, although they're going to be happening far more frequently, Category 5 hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast and devastated the panhandle of Florida in the midterm elections of just a couple of weeks before. It basically spared Pensacola, the big city, and they had enough time that they could get things back. But if that had happened a week later, and if it had hit Pensacola, the Senate election there, the gubernatorial election there, could have been affected in a big way. And now, of course, we've got all of these issues that have emerged with primaries and the pandemic. I would note, even going back, that there were elections in New York, in the city, on 9/11, primary elections. And the governor used his authority to postpone them, something that states can do for their local elections. Same thing happened after Katrina with New Orleans. So we've had instances of dealing with this, but not at a national level. You can't postpone an election unless Congress passes a law changing the date, and they'd have to be there to do it. So we need to really focus on how we can provide backup plans just in case. Right now, the most significant backup plan, given that the pandemic may reemerge in a big way in the fall, is to make sure we have other options than in-place personal voting. And that means vote by mail. And it means having absentee ballots that are sent out with enough time that people can get them. It means enough time and a postal service that works, that can get them to the designated places for counting. And every state has different rules in terms of when those have to be there. They should have postmarks. A lot of the Postal Service mail does not have postmarks. And many states are just not prepared for having 50, 60, 80% of their votes cast by mail. So this planning should have started months ago, and Congress has frankly failed to do anything that would give us that kind of protection, and we have the possibility of a chaotic election.
Well, let me ask you, because our election here in Illinois was on March 17th, right, as things were really heating up. It didn't occur to me until about 5 days before then that I was not going to want to go to the polls. And I have asthma. It's an important issue for me. And it was a terrible decision because I had missed the deadline to request a mail-in ballot. That was really the problem with our specific election, but you could see it happening other places. The election was right as people were realizing they weren't going to feel safe going to the polls. So should we be mailing ballots to every American just in case? Or what can we do to avoid those kinds of problems? And Tom, I don't know if you have something to add. We'd sure like to hear what you have to say also on this. But maybe Norm, you want to start and say, should we mail ballots to everybody?
Yeah. These are decisions that are going to be up to the states fundamentally. Although one thing that the federal government could do, if you are an overseas voter, military or otherwise, for federal elections, for the elections for president, Senate, House, you can print out at your house a federal ballot. Allowing that possibility for everybody is one kind of backstop. But other than that, you would hope that states and localities would be doing what the city of Milwaukee just did, which is to say that they're going to mail out 300,000 absentee ballots, postage free in return to all of the residents there, or California announcing that they would do it for everybody. You would hope that more states would do it. The danger at this point is, frankly, the swing states, the purple states, are going to be more reluctant to do it in many instances because of the fear, mostly on the Republican side, that if everybody voted, they would lose.
And there are still states that don't let anyone vote by mail, right? A lot of states let anyone who requests to vote by mail, but there are still states where you have to, sign something saying that you have a good reason for not.
There are very high hurdles in many states, and also a lot of states, you have to have a written excuse. And other states have no excuses, absentee balloting. There are issues with absentee ballots and with vote by mail. We've seen fraud in different places. We saw it in North Carolina in the last congressional election. They had to do a do-over, a redo of that election. But the fraud is a minor problem compared to the larger issue at this point of making sure people have an ability to vote. It's the key to our democracy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Tom, you have to unmute yourself, Tom. Tom, can you unmute? Oh, you're not unmuted yet. Tom, just 1 second. You're still on mute.
You're on mute. Bottom left.
Bottom left, there should be a microphone.
Okay.
There you go. Well, you and Ruth Bader Ginsburg have a lot in common. Okay.
And Sotomayor had troubles too. Remember?
There you go. There you go.
The only guy. I want to pick up on 2 points that Norm mentioned in passing that are so important. We have a highly sort of federalized system. By that, I don't mean nationalized, but I mean the local administration of elections, which means that the federal government can offer incentives, can offer money, but it can't make big demands about the balloting process itself. And that means local entities have incentives to do it their way. Some of it is pushed by governments at the state level, but other is at lower levels of government, including counties and the like. So it means in the end, we can't ensure everything. We really have to depend upon the goodwill and faithful execution of the charge given to all election officials to make sure ballots are able to be cast and counted in a fair manner. Now that brings up the second point, which Norm also mentioned, and a very unfortunate one, which is the intense politicization of voting and election administration more broadly. Even though there's a lot of scholarly evidence that Republicans oftentimes do better with the mail ballot than voting in person, Republicans have come to believe that the higher the turnout, the worse their fortunes in the elections. And so they have a powerful incentive to diminish turnout, not to increase it. Now, that's not true of all Republicans and all Republican officials. Mike DeWine doesn't want to diminish turnout in Ohio. He's a Republican governor, but it's a reality. And certainly the message coming from our president, Donald J. Trump, is that, if you make it easier to vote and give mail-in ballots to everyone, Republicans will be wiped out. We won't win anything. Well, A, that's untrue, inaccurate, but it it sends out a message to local administration officials and state legislatures controlled by Republicans that the odds are changes are going to be made one way or another whereby people who aren't eligible are voting, and therefore we have to be concerned about fraud, and therefore we have to implement other measures to keep that from happening. And in the worst of circumstances, you could have Republicans legislatures which constitutionally have the authority to appoint the electors who ultimately pick the president in a way that isn't faithful to the election. They may say, well, we had trouble and we couldn't have a full count, and therefore we're going to appoint electors ourselves. I mean, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it would be if so many people weren't talking about the possibility of doing such things. So that further complicates. This is just not an administrative problem. It's a huge political problem.
And I actually think there's a Supreme Court case that's being heard this week exactly on that issue of whether the electors have to vote for whoever won in their state. So let me ask you a quick question, because we want to get on to the rest, but this raises the question of whether we need another constitutional amendment on voting rights, things like maximum distance you should have to travel to vote, number of polling places per person, whether vote by mail should be easily offered. Because the people who are harmed in these kinds of situations are the people who can't afford an ID, the people who can't afford to get to the polling place, the people who can't afford to take a day off work to go register to vote. So is that the answer, or is there something easier than a constitutional amendment at this point?
Everything is easier than a constitution. That's our problem. That is, the politics are such, and with the supermajority required in Congress and in the states to ratify it, just isn't realistic. Of course, there's no constitutional reference to the right to vote, much less the conditions. Yeah. Now, a number of commissions, most recently one that Norm was on, based at University of California, Irvine, have set out standards and expectations on the very dimensions of voting that you've discussed, and these have been publicized, and that's a good thing. Norm and I did something along this line some years ago. It's very important to somehow separate the legitimate and essential elements of voting and vote counting, and keep that separate from the politics.
Right. It's a difficult issue, and as you say, I don't know the way forward. For the last 100 years, we've counted on the courts to fix these kinds of issues, and even that it's not clear that that's going to happen again in the future.
Highly problematic now.
Is mandatory voting and a direct popular vote, so that in fact both parties have incentives to play fairly and not to depress the vote.
Well, I mean, proportional representation would take care of a lot of this, right? If the Republicans thought they had a shot at a couple of seats in Chicago, they'd look at this a little bit differently than they do right now, where they don't have a chance at any of the close-in constituencies. Well, let's move on to the next question, because time is short. Continuity of government. If, the designated survivor scenario was the entire U.S. Congress, almost the entire U.S. Congress, the entire executive branch at the senior level, and the entire Supreme Court was taken out in a terrorist attack. But even something short of that, where you had, say, 3 members of the Supreme Court become incapacitated, or something we've already had in our history where you had a president and a vice president have to resign in close order. And we got lucky last time. So this is a problem with us, with humans, right? Well, we got lucky. Gerald Ford turned out to be okay. He was the president we needed. We'll be okay next time too. There's no guarantee we'll be okay next time. And as you point out, if large numbers of Congress people were lost in a terrorist attack or something else, how would we keep the legislative branch running again? So what kind of laws should states and the federal government be passing so that we could keep our government running in the case of some sort of catastrophe? Let's start with, Norm, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Tom.
So there's a short-term issue and a longer-term one. The short-term issue, of course, is the pandemic and the possibility, and we've already seen this, that Congress cannot meet in the Capitol or together in Washington. And we just had last week the Capitol physician, even though physically they can now move, we may reach a time where they can't fly, they can't travel. The Capitol physician said, this is way too dangerous. It's dangerous for you. And many of them, of course, are older and have the markers of vulnerability. For your staffs, for the gardeners, the Capitol Police, and for all the families, you shouldn't meet here. The House didn't meet. The Senate decided to go ahead because Mitch McConnell wanted to confirm more judges, but put many of the members at jeopardy. The obvious answer is the capability of voting and meeting and deliberating remotely. And that includes the committees being able to do oversight and do what they need to do. You can't get legislation unless you have a Congress that can actually act and vote and have the quorum that the Constitution requires, half the members present. The Constitution doesn't say they have to be present in the same room. And we've been pushing for this for a long time and have met resistance from the leaders. The main reason for the resistance is, I think, at least in the House, for Nancy Pelosi, it has been, you don't want to regularize this. It's important that you have, more often than not, in non-emergency situations, people meeting together. And right now, we've got a bit of a partisan divide in the House, where Pelosi's agreed to move forward with at least a rudimentary plan for remote voting and meeting, including committees. And now the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, and his caucus are opposed to it. I think they don't want oversight. But the longer term issue is, what if there is a devastating attack and you don't have a quorum? And what we had proposed was a constitutional amendment that would allow for temporary emergency appointments in the event of massive deaths or incapacitation for the House and the Senate. And we had a lot of support, but nothing happened. And that was, of course, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And over the 19 plus years since, neither party has picked up on this and done anything. The same, I would add, Cecile, is true of the outmoded Presidential Succession Act. But the Supreme Court has only, for continuity, a legislative quorum requirement of 6 justices. If you mentioned 3, if 4 of the 9 justices were incapacitated by the virus and their age makes them vulnerable, we don't have a Supreme Court. And that, at a time of many, many significant concerns, would not be a good thing.
Tom?
Cecile, I do think change is on the way in this area because it's impossible to avoid. If Congress can't function, and basically all they've been doing thus far is just coming back for voice votes or unanimous, largely unanimous votes that have been negotiated by the leaders, but that means almost no oversight of the executive and any serious legislating. But I think that's going to change largely because of the pressure from younger members who find all of this perfectly normal, as well as from the public, which has now participated in and viewed the Zoom conferences, and there's much that can be done. I'm heartened by the change in the position of the chairman of the Rules Committee, Congressman McGovern of Massachusetts, who really is now pushing to begin with a form of proxy voting, whereby those living close by members could receive the proxies, instructed votes of those stuck in their homes. But it's going to move to something, I think, much more effective. And even if Republicans resist it, I think Speaker Pelosi ought to push it through. This is a president who's not fond of the separation of powers.
Yeah.
He all power reside with him in the White House, and he's been downright belligerent in denying the legitimacy of Congress overseeing his actions and that of his administration. To the extent Congress is out of action, it just means even more power will accrue to the executive, and that's a very unhealthy development in our constitutional system.
Well, let me ask you something, because there are plenty of people, and I think you guys have argued a version of this, who have noted that even when they're all in the same room, the 535 people in the US Congress have not been very good at doing their jobs in recent decades, not been good at being a check on the president, not been good at being a check on the executive branch, not been good at passing a lot of necessary legislation, which is why we have so many executive orders. Why do we have so many executive orders on immigration? Because Congress doesn't pass immigration reform. Why do we have executive orders on wars? Because Congress hasn't passed War Powers Act since what, 1941, 42? So, what's the bigger problem? I mean, I totally get that they need to be able to meet electronically, but can we now go up a little further? How is Congress so broken?
But Cecile, I think it's just a mistake to refer to Congress. There's a House and a Senate, and the Senate is now controlled by Republicans and the House Democrats. The Democrats can do some things, but they can't enact legislation and get it signed all on their own. And for the immediate pandemic-inspired legislation, including stimulus and hospital aid and so on, there was sufficient incentives for the three parties, the White House, the Senate, and the House, to come together. But that's now ending, and it's ending very, very quickly. The bottom line is that given the nature of our party system and given the occupant of the White House, the only solution lies in the short term, and about 6 months from now, on November 3rd, I believe, it's election day. Only single party control in the short term can ensure essential legislation gets passed. And the longer term, we need two functioning effective parties, but that's a longer term project, primarily one facing the Republican Party.
So I would just add, this is partly a structural issue. Our system is not set up to do bold things or to deal with long-term problems that involve short-term pain. But the main problem we have now is the cultural one. And that is the tribalization of our politics. It's not just simply partisans clashing. We had decades where you could look at the results of divided government and compare them very favorably, and sometimes even better, to united government. Back when the parties were internally more divided, in part, but also there was a sense of loyalty to the institutions. Now it's a very, very different world. And I see a Republican Party, frankly, that has become a bit more of a cult than it is a party. And you'll get people who privately will even acknowledge that they're voting for or supporting things that they really don't believe are very good, but they feel compelled to do so because the fear of being excommunicated or shunned or attacked is so great. We see that so much in the Senate now. And what used to be an institutional loyalty, willingness to do oversight so that you could get government working well, has just gone away into protecting the miscreants in your own party. And then I think you have to add one other phenomenon, which is that conservatism used to mean wanting a smaller government, but that a government that had its necessary components working well with professional people, with a respect for expertise in science. And now it's a more radical version or vision that if any part of government works, that's bad because people are going to like it. And an embrace of incompetence in many ways, an acceptance of corruption, and basically no respect for expertise or science or professionalism. And all of those things are going to be harder to deal with than some of these structural issues of how we make a system that can be responsive.
Yeah, you look back, you guys went to school in Michigan. You probably remember exactly where you were the day that Magic Johnson did his press conference and announced that he was HIV positive, right? Every American who was over 10 remembers that press conference. And if you had told us that day that Magic Johnson was still going to be alive in 2020 and going strong, and that he will have, done this amazing renaissance in Los Angeles. I mean, the good that the man has done in this world all these decades is amazing. We would have been shocked. And all of that, controlling the HIV epidemic and getting the numbers down and controlling the epidemic in Asia, where we thought that whole countries were going to be decimated, that was because there were thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands, of U.S. government civil servants, not necessarily doing it full time, but doing it 5 hours here, 10 hours there, working on all sorts of things. And I look now and I say, where is that same government effort? The government effort that, I read and the band played on. I wanted to go back to school so I could go to work for the CDC because they are heroes in that book. And now suddenly they're villains. How did this happen?
One thing I would say, Tom and I both have very close ties to people in Australia. We've traveled there many times. We know leaders and others. The Australian experience is so very different than ours. They've gotten their handle on this. But one part of it, I just saw a survey across the political spectrum. The Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party is their conservative one, the Labour Party, they all accepted the expertise that said we've got to socially distance ourselves, and they accepted the science.
Yeah.
And here we are radically different. There is a total divide between the parties in terms of whether you believe the scientists, whether you think you're vulnerable to getting ill. And so this is a problem that's not just the politicians, it's more deeply embedded in our culture. And it's moved us away from a sense that we're a country as a whole into one of competing groups. And, some of the motivation is you want to own the other side, but mostly it means owning the liberals at this point. That's really a challenge for us, and it's going to result in a lot of mayhem.
It's not that there's no good news. For those of you who watch Governor Cuomo's daily briefing this morning, it was a report on what New Yorkers, the public, has accomplished over a period of weeks, really, to bend the curve and basically now have a more positive trend than almost any place in the country. The cooperation has really been quite extraordinary. But the reality is that we are a nation of individuals, but of groups as well, and groups with strong social identities and very diverse views. Some are mobilized by the notion that political correctness, those liberal professors in mainstream media are doing what they want to do and hurting the country. And that then applies to scientists and anyone who can be categorized as part of the elite. And that's working against us. I'd also remind you, the Spanish flu, the 1917-18 flu pandemic was deadly, but during that time we saw the heyday of Jim Crow. This is a period of lynchings increasing and tremendous domestic violence. So remember, that's also a part of the history of our country. And the reality is, if a majority feel otherwise, they have to be motivated to turn out and change the government. They have to have the means of doing so that is fair, is of practically casting their ballot. And we have to have those ballots counted fairly and then honored by the party in power.
Yeah.
Ever since the election of 1800, we've accepted the peaceful transfer of power.
Right.
And right now we have serious threats to that. I don't know if Donald Trump would leave office if it's a close election in the Electoral College and he loses. I believe he could file lawsuits, check the count. He could raise the objection before all the ballots are counted in some states, especially with all the absentee ballots. So,
and it'll take courage. It'll take courage from the Republican Party and from members of Congress to stand up to that, which we haven't seen a lot of courage in recent weeks. Which brings us to one of the questions that's come in here on CCGA Live. What is the future of the Republican Party post-Trump? Can the moderate wing of the party make a comeback?
There is no moderate wing in the Republican Party in Congress now. There certainly are moderate governors, and you can go to states where Republicans, I mean, the best examples are Massachusetts and Maryland, strong blue states with Republican governors who are conservative in the old style. As Norton said, yeah, we'd rather have lower taxes, but we raise taxes when we need to, and we'd rather have smaller government, but we want a government that works, and that's that. It's not.
Can we do that, or do we need a new party? So this is the question: can the Republican Party, which is so taken over by single issues right now, can it heal itself, or do we need a third party to come out of there somehow?
Well, first, we can't. The system is geared towards two parties, so it would have to be a replacement. It's going to be a while, and I agree with Tom. I would add Mike DeWine, the governor of Ohio, who is much more conservative than either Charlie Baker or Larry Hogan, but who's accepted science and moved in the right direction. There's a problem-solving contingent out there. But frankly, if you look at the farm team, the state legislatures, the city councils, the party officials, they're more radical than the members of Congress at this point.
And some of the city councils.
I think it's going to take a landslide loss in 2020 and then another loss in 2022. I believe in the rule of three. If you lose 3 elections in a row, you realize you've got to change the way you do business. Yeah. And that would be a jolt, and it would bring some traction to those never Trumper Republicans who stayed Republican, who many of whom are very conservative, but believe in institutions, the rule of law, and the need for problem solving and the need for compromise. We're not going to see that for a while, and we're going to have to go through a substantial period, I'm afraid, of significant dysfunction.
So I'm looking at the questions here. You guys can't see them. There are so many questions about the Postal Service and the new Postmaster General designee. And I know that this is in part because it's all over people's Facebook pages and other places. So I honestly can't imagine rural state congressmen letting the post office fold. I just can't. And I think that this is a lot of noise that's obfuscating other things, but maybe I'm wrong. So I want to hear what you guys think.
This is a real test, Cecile, about the ability of a majority of the public and of citizens and voters in a wide variety of districts to reflect that sentiment and basically overrule Trump's sort of narcissistic, self-absorbed battle with Jeff Bezos and who owns the Washington Post, which writes bad things about Donald Trump, he reports, and which also has a contractual agreement for the last leg of delivery in some respects. Somehow he thinks he's doing something good for himself, but this has gone too far. I think in the end, there'll be a rising up and Trump will not succeed.
I'm worried. First of all, of course, you mentioned the Postmaster General. This is the term that I've used since the beginning of the Trump presidency is I kind of revived an old word, kakistocracy, which is a Greek root. Actually, if you know what kaka means, you'll understand where it comes from. It's government of the worst sort by the worst and most unscrupulous among us. And to pick as a postmaster general somebody with no background, no experience, but basically a crony at this point, to drag your feet on funding the Postal Service, Tom is right, they're not going to go out of business, but they could be hampered enough that the vote by mail could be distorted and disgraced along the way. And that's a real danger that we have. There'll be a backlash if people don't get their mail. If the costs of packages, they're not going to really hurt Jeff Bezos. He'll go to Amazon, will go to FedEx and UPS, but people are going to pay more for their goods and they won't get them as rapidly. And people are going to be upset about it, but it may come too late for the election. So there's a real concern here that they will starve the Postal Service enough that it'll disrupt service just when we need it the most.
I think the other thing that bothers me is, yet again, you have some very wealthy people saying they don't really care about a bunch of retired postal workers who aren't going to get their pensions. They want to take away the pensions of postal workers. Yeah. There was a time where we realized that paying people's pensions, federal retirees' pensions, was good for local economies because it enabled them to go out and spend money and, do other things. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting. And there's a repeat of a question I asked earlier. I asked, do we need a constitutional amendment? But if we don't have a constitutional amendment, is there anything that can be done to stop states from making it so difficult for certain groups of people to vote? Or is it just going to... even federal legislation is not forever, right? It can be overturned by the next Congress. But
there will be hundreds of lawyers from both parties out sort of patrolling the systems, and when they see violations of filing lawsuits, the question is, will the judiciary act quickly and decisively? Has it been tainted by Mitch McConnell's success and only thing he cares about of filling the judicial branch with his kind of conservatives? So, but that's one set of actions that certainly will take place. The other is just the public awareness of it and the incentives. The public, if motivated, can roll over some of these objections. We saw in Wisconsin, they had 5 polling places in Milwaukee where they usually have hundreds, and people turned out and kept their social distance. That's a strong motivation that we saw in 2018, and it may be enough to overcome these other impediments.
And Florida passed a referendum that returned the right of vote to convicted felons, right? So there are even legislative actions that we as a populace can take even when our legislatures are refusing to do the right thing. I want to thank both of you. This has been fascinating. To all of you who are watching, we are going to be posting this on our website and on all of our social media channels sometime later this afternoon, Central Time. So go ahead and tweet about it or put it on Facebook or whatever you want to do. Watch it again. You can find all sorts of things written by these two great men online, and all of their books are fabulous. I recommend all of them. And I want to thank all of you for your decades of service to democracy, which is something that I never really thought I was going to have to say from a place like this until about 5 years ago. But we now need to guard our democracy. And so thank you very much for all of your work for doing that. And it's been an honor talking to you.
Thank you, Cecile. Great job.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it, Cecile.
Thank you very much.